A mother's scream cuts through the night air, desperate and raw as she cradles her infant against her chest. Two figures loom over her, their hands reaching, grabbing, trying to pull the small bundle from her protective arms. Her voice breaks as she pleads for someone, anyone, to help her. The baby cries, sensing the terror radiating from its mother. The attackers grow more aggressive, their patience wearing thin. But they don't notice the shadow moving closer, the silent observer who has been watching from the beginning. A man steps forward from the darkness, his presence commanding without a single word spoken. What happens in the next moments will restore your faith in humanity and remind you that evil does not always win when good people refuse to stand aside. Earlier that day, the mother had been living an ordinary life, the kind most people take for granted. She woke up to her baby's soft sounds, fed the child with gentle hands, and went about her daily routine with the quiet contentment that comes from loving someone more than yourself. She ran simple errands, stopped by the grocery store, picked up a few necessities, and started her walk home as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The neighborhood she lived in was decent enough during daylight hours, but everyone knew that certain streets became less safe after dark. She had always been careful, always aware of her surroundings, but today her errands had taken longer than expected. The baby needed changing, the store was crowded, and by the time she left, the light was already fading. She walked quickly, her pace determined, her arms wrapped securely around her child. The world can change in an instant, and danger rarely announces itself with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, wearing a familiar face or hiding behind a friendly question. And there are those who have seen enough of this cruelty to dedicate their lives to standing against it, even when no one asks them to, even when no one knows their name. The mother had heard stories about such people, whispers of someone who protected the neighborhood, but she had never paid much attention to those tales. They seemed like urban legends, comforting stories people told themselves to feel safer in an increasingly dangerous world. She had always relied on common sense and caution, trusting that if she avoided risky situations, she would be fine. But life doesn't always allow us to choose when danger appears, and sometimes all the caution in the world isn't enough to keep us safe. The mother turned onto a street that would cut her travel time in half, but it was quieter than she preferred. Fewer people walked this route, fewer lights illuminated the sidewalk, and the buildings on either side seemed to lean in, casting long shadows across the pavement. She felt it before she saw anything concrete, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the instinctive knowledge that someone was watching her. She adjusted her grip on the baby and walked faster, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. Footsteps echoed behind her, matching her pace, and when she sped up, they sped up too. She glanced over her shoulder and saw two men, their faces partially obscured by hoods, their body language casual but predatory. She tried to convince herself they were just walking the same direction, that it meant nothing, but deep down she knew better. Her breathing quickened, and she clutched her baby tighter, whispering soft reassurances, even as her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. The men closed the distance between them, and one called out in a voice that was too friendly, too smooth. He asked if she needed help, if she was lost, if she was alone. She didn't respond, didn't slow down, but they continued to follow. The second man laughed, a sound that held no warmth, and they moved faster now, no longer pretending to keep their distance. The mother's mind raced through her options, each one seeming more hopeless than the last. She could try to run, but they were faster, and she was carrying her baby. She could scream, but the street was empty and no one would hear her. She could try to reason with them, but the cold calculation in their eyes told her that words would be useless. She thought about her phone in her bag, but reaching for it would require letting go of her baby, and that was something she would never do. The men were getting closer, their intentions becoming clearer with every step, and the mother realized with sickening certainty that she was in serious danger. The mother's path was blocked as one of the men stepped in front of her, forcing her to stop. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide, her arms instinctively shielding her baby. The second man moved behind her, cutting off her escape route. They stood on either side of her now, their intentions no longer hidden behind false politeness. The first man reached out, his fingers brushing against the blanket wrapped around the infant, and the mother jerked away, her voice breaking as she screamed for help. The baby wailed, frightened by the sudden tension, and the sound seemed to fuel the attacker's urgency. They demanded she hand over her bag, her phone, anything of value, but their eyes kept drifting to the child, and the mother's terror reached a new height. She begged them to leave her alone, promised she would give them whatever they wanted, but they ignored her words. One of them grabbed her arm, trying to pull the baby from her grasp, and she resisted with every ounce of strength she had. Her screams grew louder, more desperate, echoing off the walls of the empty street. She called out for someone to save her baby, her voice cracking with the kind of anguish that only a parent can know. The attackers grew frustrated, their movements more forceful, and the mother felt her grip beginning to weaken. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how alone she was, how helpless. The street remained empty, the windows of the surrounding buildings dark and indifferent. She thought of all the things she would never get to teach her child, all the moments they would never share, and the injustice of it all threatened to crush her. But she didn't stop fighting, didn't stop screaming, because giving up was not an option. Her nails dug into her own arms as she held her baby tighter, her muscles burning from the effort of resisting the attackers' attempts to pry the child away. The first man cursed under his breath, his frustration turning to anger, and he grabbed her shoulder roughly, trying to spin her around. The second man reached for the baby's blanket again, and the mother twisted away, nearly losing her balance in the process. She was running out of strength, running out of options, and the realization that she might actually lose her child became more real with each passing second. Her vision blurred with tears, her throat raw from screaming, and she felt herself starting to falter under the relentless assault. Then, without warning, a voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady, carrying a weight that made everyone freeze. The voice belonged to a man who stepped out from the shadows with the kind of confidence that comes from experience, from having faced situations like this more times than anyone should. He positioned himself between the attackers and the mother, his stance protective but not aggressive, his eyes locked on the two men with an intensity that needed no explanation. He told them to leave, to walk away now while they still could, his words spoken quietly but with absolute authority. The attackers turned to face him, sizing him up, trying to determine if he was a real threat or just someone who would run at the first sign of trouble. They saw a man of average height, dressed in dark clothing that allowed him to blend into the night, his face partially hidden but his eyes visible enough to convey his determination. One of the attackers laughed nervously, trying to maintain his bravado, and demanded to know who this stranger thought he was. The vigilante didn't respond with words, didn't waste time explaining himself. He simply stood his ground, his posture radiating a readiness to act if necessary. The second attacker took a step forward, attempting to intimidate him, but the vigilante didn't flinch. He shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, that he had training and experience these men lacked. The attackers exchanged a glance, their confidence beginning to waver. They had expected an easy target, a frightened woman alone with her baby, not someone willing to stand in their way. The first man tried to assert dominance, stepping closer to the vigilante and raising his voice, demanding that he mind his own business and walk away. But the vigilante held his ground, his expression unchanging, his focus absolute. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, but something in his demeanor communicated more danger than any shouted warning could have. The mother watched from behind him, her heart still racing, her arms still wrapped protectively around her baby. She didn't know who this man was or why he had chosen to help her, but she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the attack had begun. The vigilante took a single step forward, and that small movement carried more menace than any threat could have. He spoke again, his voice low and even, reminding them that they had a choice to make right now, in this moment, and that choice would determine what happened next. He told them he wasn't interested in hurting them, wasn't looking for a fight, but he also made it clear that he would not allow them to harm the mother or her child. The attackers hesitated, their bravado crumbling under the weight of his unwavering stare. They realized they had misjudged the situation, that this man was not someone they could intimidate or overpower. The first attacker muttered something under his breath, a weak attempt to save face, and began backing away. The second man followed, his earlier aggression replaced by uncertainty. They retreated slowly at first, then faster, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting the vigilante to chase them, but he didn't move, didn't pursue them. He simply watched until they disappeared into the darkness, ensuring they were truly gone before turning his attention to the mother. The street fell silent, except for the baby's fading cries and the mother's ragged breathing. She stood frozen, her arms still wrapped tightly around her child, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The danger had passed, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins, leaving her trembling and unsteady. She looked at the man who had saved them, trying to understand how he had managed to make two dangerous criminals flee without even raising his fists. There had been no violence, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet assertion of his presence and his willingness to protect her. It was the kind of courage that didn't announce itself with grand gestures, but instead manifested in the simple act of standing between danger and those who couldn't defend themselves. The mother felt her knees weaken as the full weight of what had almost happened began to settle over her, and she had to steady herself against a nearby wall to keep from collapsing. The vigilante approached her slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, giving her time to realize he meant no harm. He spoke softly, asking if she was hurt, if the baby was safe, his tone gentle in stark contrast to the authority he had displayed moments before. The mother nodded, unable to form words yet, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what almost happened began to sink in. She looked at the man who had saved them, trying to see his face clearly, but the dim light and his positioning made it difficult. She didn't need to see his features to understand who he was, or rather what he was. Someone who had chosen to step in when others would have walked away. Someone who had made it his mission to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She tried to thank him, her voice breaking with emotion, but he shook his head gently, telling her there was no need. He asked if she lived nearby, if she had someone who could walk her home, and she nodded again, finding her voice long enough to tell him she was only a few blocks away. He offered to walk with her, to make sure she reached her door safely, but she could see he was already preparing to leave, to disappear back into the shadows from which he had emerged. She wanted to ask him his name, wanted to know how to find him again, how to properly express her gratitude, but something in his demeanor told her he wouldn't answer those questions. He reassured her one more time, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with his earlier intensity, and then he stepped back, creating distance between them. The mother felt an overwhelming need to make him understand what he had done, how much it meant, how he had saved not just her life, but her child's entire future. She told him through her tears that she would never forget what he had done, that she would spend the rest of her life grateful for this moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief acknowledgement of her words before he turned away. The mother watched as he turned and walked away, his figure gradually blending into the darkness of the street. She called out a final thank you, her voice carrying across the empty space, and though he didn't turn around, she saw him raise a hand in acknowledgement before disappearing completely. She stood there for a long moment, holding her baby close, feeling the rapid beating of her own heart begin to slow. The child had stopped crying, sensing perhaps that the danger had passed, and nestled against its mother's chest with the trust that only an infant can have. The mother looked down at her baby, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, and whispered a promise that she would never take their safety for granted again. She began walking toward home, her steps unsteady at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The street that had seemed so threatening now felt different, as if the vigilante's presence had left some residual protection in his wake. She thought about what would have happened if he hadn't been there, if no one had stepped in to help, and the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Her child would have been taken, her life would have been shattered, and she would have been left with nothing but grief and guilt. But that hadn't happened, because one person had chosen to act, had chosen to be the difference between tragedy and survival. She wondered how many other people he had helped, how many lives he had saved, and whether anyone truly knew who he was. The urban legends she had dismissed as comforting fantasies suddenly seemed much more real, and she realized that sometimes the stories people tell to feel safer are based on truth, on the actions of individuals who refuse to let evil go unchallenged. When she finally reached her home, she unlocked the door with shaking hands and stepped inside, locking it behind her with a sense of finality that made her feel safe for the first time since the ordeal began. She carried her baby to the nursery, laid the child gently in the crib, and watched as the infant's eyes slowly closed in peaceful sleep. The baby had no memory of what had happened, no understanding of how close they had come to disaster, and the mother was grateful for that small mercy. She sat down in the chair beside the crib, her body suddenly heavy with exhaustion, and allowed herself to process everything she had been holding inside. The tears came freely now, not tears of fear, but of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion that she could barely name. She thought about the vigilante, about his calm presence and his willingness to risk himself for strangers. She wondered how many times he had done this, how many people he had helped, and whether anyone knew who he really was. She realized she would probably never see him again, never get the chance to properly thank him, but she also understood that he didn't do this for recognition or gratitude. He did it because someone had to, because he had seen too much suffering and had decided to stand against it in whatever way he could. The mother sat in that chair for hours, watching her baby sleep, replaying the events of the evening in her mind and trying to understand the kind of person who would dedicate their life to protecting strangers. She thought about his eyes, the way they had conveyed both strength and compassion, and she realized that he wasn't just someone who fought against criminals. He was someone who truly cared about people, who saw value in every life, and who couldn't stand aside when others were in danger. That kind of commitment required not just courage, but empathy. The ability to feel another person's fear and pain as if it were your own, and the determination to prevent that suffering whenever possible. The days that followed were different for the mother. She went about her routines with a new awareness, a heightened sense of her surroundings, and the fragility of the safety most people assumed was guaranteed. She looked at other parents with their children and wondered if they understood how quickly everything could change, how important it was to stay vigilant, to trust their instincts, to never assume that danger couldn't find them. She also felt compelled to share her story, not for attention or sympathy, but because she believed people needed to hear it. She told her friends and family what had happened, describing the attack and the intervention in detail, and she saw the impact her words had on them. Some were shocked, others were moved to tears, and many expressed a desire to be more aware, more prepared, more willing to help if they ever witnessed someone in danger. The mother realized that her experience, as traumatic as it had been, carried a message that extended beyond her own personal survival. It was a reminder that evil exists in the world, that there are people who prey on the vulnerable and the defenseless, but it was also proof that goodness exists too, that there are individuals who refuse to stand aside when others need help. She began sharing her story more widely, speaking at community meetings and neighborhood gatherings, and she was surprised by how many people responded to her message. Some shared their own experiences of being helped by strangers, of moments when someone had intervened to save them or their loved ones. Others admitted they had witnessed dangerous situations but had been too afraid to act, and they expressed regret for not being braver. The mother used these conversations to encourage people to look out for one another, to create networks of support that made it harder for predators to find victims, and to trust that one person's actions could make a real difference. She thought often about the concept of heroism, about what it meant to be truly brave. The vigilante hadn't been wearing a uniform or carrying a badge, hadn't been acting under any official authority or obligation. He had simply been a person who saw someone in danger and chose to intervene, accepting the risk to himself without hesitation. That kind of courage, the mother realized, was more profound than any grand gesture or public display of valor. It was quiet, humble, and deeply personal, rooted not in a desire for glory, but in a fundamental belief that people have a responsibility to protect one another. She wondered what had shaped him into the person he had become. What experiences had led him to dedicate his life to this kind of work? Had he lost someone, witnessed an injustice that changed him forever, or simply been born with an innate sense of justice that refused to be silenced? She would never know the answers to these questions, but she found herself hoping that wherever he was, whatever he was doing, he knew that his actions had mattered. He had saved 2 lives that night, but his impact extended far beyond that immediate moment. He had restored her faith in humanity, given her hope that the world wasn't as dark as it sometimes seemed, and inspired her to be more courageous in her own life. She began volunteering in her community, working with organizations that supported victims of violence and crime, and she found purpose in helping others navigate the trauma she had experienced. She understood their fear, their sense of violation, their struggle to feel safe again, and she used her own story to show them that recovery was possible, that they could reclaim their lives and their sense of security. As weeks turned into months, the mother found herself sharing the story with even more people, speaking at community meetings and neighborhood gatherings about the importance of looking out for one another. She talked about the warning signs she had ignored, the instincts she had felt but dismissed, and the lessons she had learned about trusting her intuition. She encouraged other parents to be vigilant, to teach their children about safety, and to never assume that someone else would step in to help if they witnessed danger. But she also emphasized the positive side of her experience, the fact that there were people like the Vigilante who dedicated themselves to protecting others. She urged her listeners to be those people in their own communities, to speak up when they saw injustice, to intervene when someone needed help, and to create networks of support that made it harder for predators to find victims. The response was overwhelming, with many people expressing gratitude for her willingness to share such a personal and frightening experience. Some told their own stories of being helped by strangers, of moments when someone had stepped in to save them or their loved ones. Others admitted they had witnessed dangerous situations but had been too afraid to act, and they vowed to be braver in the future. The mother saw a shift happening in her community, a growing awareness that safety was everyone's responsibility, not just the responsibility of law enforcement or security personnel. People began organizing neighborhood watch programs, creating walking groups for those who worked late hours, and establishing communication networks that allowed residents to alert one another to potential dangers. The mother became a central figure in these efforts, her story serving as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder of what could happen when people were caught alone and vulnerable, but also what could be achieved when someone chose to intervene. The Vigilante, wherever he was, continued his work in the shadows. He didn't know about the impact his actions had created, didn't hear the mother's speeches or see the changes she was inspiring in her community. He simply moved through the city as he always had, watching, listening, and stepping in when necessary. He had stopped counting the number of times he had intervened, the number of lives he had touched, because that wasn't why he did this. He did it because he had seen too much suffering, too many victims left to deal with trauma alone, while their attackers went unpunished. He had witnessed the failure of systems that were supposed to protect people, had seen how easily the vulnerable could be exploited, and had decided that someone needed to fill the gap. His methods were not always conventional, and he knew that many would question his approach, but he also knew that he made a difference. Every person he helped, every attack he prevented, was a small victory against the darkness that threatened to overwhelm the innocent. He didn't think of himself as a hero, didn't want recognition or praise. He was simply a man who had chosen to act instead of standing aside, who had decided that his skills and his courage could be used to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He had developed these skills over years of training and experience, learning to read situations quickly, to assess threats accurately, and to intervene effectively without escalating violence unnecessarily. He understood that his presence alone was often enough to deter criminals, that the confidence he projected and the authority he commanded could make potential attackers reconsider their plans. He preferred this approach to physical confrontation, knowing that every fight he avoided was a situation that had been resolved without anyone getting hurt, without creating additional trauma or violence. There were nights when he questioned whether his efforts mattered, whether one person could truly make a difference in a world filled with so much cruelty. But then he would think about the mother and her baby, about the look of relief on her face when she realized they were safe, and he would remember why he continued. Every life saved was worth the risk. Every moment of safety he provided justified the danger he faced. He knew there would always be more attackers, more threats, more people in need of help, but that knowledge didn't discourage him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve, reminding him that his work was never finished, that there would always be someone who needed protection. He moved through the streets with a purpose that never wavered, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of trouble, his instincts honed by years of experience. He had learned to read body language, to identify predatory behavior, to sense when someone was in danger before the situation escalated. These skills had been developed through countless encounters, through mistakes and near misses, through the hard lessons that came from putting himself in harm's way. He had been injured more times than he could count, had faced threats to his own life, and had walked away from situations that could have ended very differently. But he had also saved people, had prevented tragedies, and had given victims the chance to return home safely to their families. That was what mattered, what kept him going even when his body ached and his spirit felt weary. He thought about the people he had helped over the years, wondered where they were now and whether his intervention had made a lasting difference in their lives. He would never know most of their stories, would never learn how they had moved forward after their encounters with danger, but he didn't need to know. It was enough to know that in that moment, when they had needed someone, he had been there. The city he protected was vast and complex, filled with neighborhoods that ranged from prosperous to impoverished, from safe to dangerous. He knew the patterns of crime, understood where and when attacks were most likely to occur, and positioned himself accordingly. He wasn't omnipresent, couldn't be everywhere at once, but he maximized his impact by focusing on the areas where people were most vulnerable. He watched over late-night workers walking home alone, kept an eye on parks where children played, and monitored the streets where predators were known to hunt. He had developed a network of information sources, people who trusted him and would alert him to potential dangers, though he kept these relationships carefully anonymous. No one knew his real identity, and he intended to keep it that way. The moment he became publicly known, the moment his face and name were attached to his actions, he would lose the ability to move freely, to observe without being observed. His anonymity was his greatest asset, allowing him to blend into any environment, to appear and disappear without leaving a trace. He had carefully cultivated this invisibility, learning to move through crowds unnoticed, to position himself in shadows where he could see without being seen, and to time his interventions for maximum impact. He understood that his effectiveness depended on criminals not knowing when or where he might appear, on maintaining an element of unpredictability that kept potential attackers uncertain and cautious. He had become something of a legend in certain circles, whispered about in conversations between criminals who had encountered him or heard stories from others. Some dismissed these tales as exaggeration, but those who had faced him knew better, and their warnings to others helped create a deterrent effect that extended beyond his direct interventions. The mother's story became something of a legend in her community, passed from person to person, embellished slightly with each retelling but never losing its core truth. People began referring to the vigilante as a guardian angel, a protector who watched over the innocent and struck fear into the hearts of those who would do harm. Some claimed to have seen him, to have been saved by him, though not all of these accounts were verifiable. The mother didn't mind the embellishments, didn't correct the details that had been altered over time. What mattered was the message, the idea that people could and should look out for one another, that courage wasn't reserved for those with special training or authority. She saw the impact of the story in the way people treated each other, in the increased willingness to intervene when someone needed help, in the networks of support that formed as neighbors began watching out for one another. The vigilante had sparked something larger than himself, had inspired a movement without ever intending to, and the mother felt honored to be part of spreading that message. She received letters and messages from people across the city, some sharing their own experiences with crime and violence, others expressing gratitude for the hope her story provided. One letter came from an elderly woman who had been mugged years earlier and had lived in fear ever since, rarely leaving her home except when absolutely necessary. She wrote that hearing the mother's story had given her courage to reclaim her life, to start going out again and reconnecting with her community. Another letter came from a young man who admitted he had witnessed an assault months earlier but had been too scared to intervene. He expressed deep regret for his inaction and vowed that if he ever encountered a similar situation, he would be brave enough to help. These responses showed the mother that her decision to share her story had been the right one, that vulnerability and honesty could inspire others to be better, stronger, and more compassionate. Years passed, and the baby the mother had fought so desperately to protect grew into a child, then a teenager, and eventually a young adult. The mother told the story of that night many times over the years, shaping it into a lesson about courage, compassion, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Her child grew up understanding that the world could be dangerous, but also that there were people who dedicated their lives to making it safer. The lesson took root, and as the child matured, they began to embody the same values the vigilante had demonstrated that night. They volunteered in the community, stood up for those who were bullied or marginalized, and refused to be a bystander when they witnessed injustice. The mother watched with pride as her child became the kind of person who made the world better, who carried forward the legacy of that mysterious guardian who had saved them both. She sometimes wondered if the vigilante knew the full extent of his impact, if he understood that his actions had not only saved 2 lives, but had inspired countless others to be braver, kinder, and more willing to help. She hoped that somehow, somewhere, he could see what his courage had created, the ripples that had spread from that single moment of intervention. Her child had chosen to pursue a career in social work, dedicating their professional life to helping vulnerable populations and working to create systemic changes that would protect people before they needed someone like the Vigilante to save them. The mother saw this as the ultimate tribute to the man who had saved them, a way of honoring his actions by working to create a world where such interventions were less necessary. She and her child often discussed the balance between individual action and systemic change, acknowledging that both were necessary, that heroes like the Vigilante provided immediate protection while advocates and activists worked to address the root causes of violence and exploitation. The Vigilante continued his work, never stopping, never seeking recognition, never wavering in his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. He had aged over the years, his body bearing the marks of countless encounters, but his resolve remained unshaken. He had saved hundreds of people, possibly thousands, though he had lost count long ago. Each person he helped became part of a larger tapestry of good that spread through the city in ways he could never fully see. Some of those he had saved went on to help others, creating a ripple effect that multiplied his impact far beyond his individual actions. He didn't think about legacy or how he would be remembered, focused only on the immediate task of keeping people safe. But if he had known about the mother and her child, about the story that had spread through the community and the changes it had inspired, he might have allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, a brief acknowledgement that his work mattered more than he could ever know. He continued to move through the streets with the same dedication he had always shown, his senses alert to danger, his commitment unwavering. There were nights when his body protested the physical demands he placed on it, when old injuries ached and new ones added to his collection of scars. There were moments when he felt the weight of loneliness that came from living a life apart from normal human connection, from maintaining the secrecy necessary to continue his work. But these doubts and discomforts never lasted long, always pushed aside by the knowledge that somewhere in the city, someone needed help, and he had the ability to provide it. He had long ago accepted that this was his purpose, his calling, and he embraced it fully despite the personal cost. The story of the Vigilante and the mother became a testament to the power of individual action, a reminder that one person's courage can change the course of many lives. It challenged the notion that ordinary people are helpless in the face of danger, that only trained professionals can make a difference. It proved that anyone can be a hero if they choose to act instead of looking away, if they decide that protecting others is more important than protecting their own comfort or safety. The mother's willingness to share her story, to be vulnerable about her fear and her gratitude, gave others permission to do the same. It created a culture where people felt empowered to speak up, to intervene, to be the kind of person who makes the world safer for everyone. And at the heart of it all was a man who had simply decided that he couldn't stand aside while others suffered, who had chosen to use his strength and his courage to shield the innocent from harm. The impact of his choice extended far beyond that single night, creating waves of positive change that touched countless lives. The mother's community became safer, more connected, more willing to support its vulnerable members. Other communities heard the story and were inspired to create similar networks of protection and support. Young people heard about the Vigilante and were motivated to develop skills that would allow them to help others, whether through formal training in law enforcement or emergency services, or simply by becoming more aware and willing to intervene when necessary. The story became part of the cultural fabric of the city, a shared narrative that reinforced values of courage, compassion, and community responsibility. Heroes aren't always seen, but their actions never go unnoticed. They leave marks on the people they save, on the communities they protect, and on the culture they help to shape. The Vigilante who stepped out of the shadows that night didn't do it for fame or recognition, didn't expect gratitude or reward. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because someone needed help and he was able to provide it. That simple act of courage reverberated through the lives of everyone it touched, creating a legacy that extended far beyond that single moment on a dark street. The mother and her child were the most obvious beneficiaries, but they were not the only ones. Everyone who heard the story, everyone who was inspired to be braver and more compassionate, everyone who chose to help someone in need because they remembered what one person had done, they were all part of that legacy. The Vigilante had proven that goodness exists in the world, that there are people who will stand against evil even when no one asks them to, even when no one will ever know their name. And that knowledge, that proof that humanity is capable of such selfless courage, is perhaps the greatest gift one person can give to another. It reminds us that we are not alone, that someone is watching out for us, and that we too have the power to be that person for someone else. In a world that often feels dark and dangerous, that reminder is more valuable than any amount of recognition or praise, more powerful than any weapon, and more enduring than any monument. The mother understood this, carried it with her every day and passed it on to her child and to everyone she met. And somewhere in the shadows, the vigilante continued his work, knowing that as long as there were people who needed protection, he would be there to provide it, unseen but never absent, unnamed but never forgotten. His life had become a quiet dedication to the principle that every person matters, that every life has value, and that those who have the ability to protect others have a responsibility to do so. He didn't need thanks or recognition to validate his choices, didn't require public acknowledgement to justify his sacrifices. The knowledge that he had made a difference, that he had prevented suffering and saved lives, was reward enough. He understood that his work would never be finished, that there would always be another person in danger, another predator to stop, another victim to save. But rather than feeling discouraged by the endless nature of his mission, he found purpose in it, a reason to wake up each day and continue the work that defined his existence. He had become something more than just a man, transformed by his commitment into a symbol of hope for those who knew his story, and a force for good that operated beyond the reach of normal recognition or understanding.